Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here this afternoon. My name is Kathy Morris. I am the Sylvia and Leonard Marks Director of Collections and Exhibitions and the Curator of Decorative Arts here at the Clark. And I'm the curator of the exhibition Wall Power, a modern French tapestry from the Mobilier National Paris. And I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome KLH Wells to the Clark for a talk related to the Wall Power exhibition. Kay is Associate Professor of American Art and Architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she has taught since 2014. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. Kay is author of an impressive array of publications touching on many aspects of art and design of the past few centuries, in fact. But in 2019, she published a book called Weaving Modernism, Postwar Tapestry Between Paris and New York, which delves deeply into the history of French tapestry in the mid-20th century and its reception in the United States. This book was an essential reference for me as I was working on the Wall Power exhibition, and I was not surprised to learn that it has earned many accolades, including winner of the 2020 CCAC Award for Excellence in Scholarly Research and Publication. Kay is currently working on her next book entitled Uncanny Revivals, Designing an American Identity, expected to be published by Yale University Press in 2026. Today, this afternoon, Kay will reflect on the role of women in the French tapestry revival, considering their roles as artists, dealers, and weavers. Please join me in welcoming Kay to the podium.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so delighted to be here and to be speaking to you all today about modern tapestries. It's always a treat to see modern tapestries in person, and I have to commend Kathy and the Clark for the really incredible exhibition that they have put together here. I think when we see modern tapestries, or tapestries in general, we're really struck with wonder at how they could have been made. You know, they're just so impressive, they're so clearly well-crafted. We have this kind of inherent sense of the hand labor, the skill, the discipline that must have gone into making them. And yet, part of what I hope to show you today is how the labor of making tapestries really goes well beyond the weaving itself. As important as the weaving process is, and I don't in any way mean to discount it, these tapestries really begin before that with an artist's design, and they really begin even before that with the person who commissions or invites the artist to design for tapestry. So today I'm going to be talking about the various roles that women played in the 20th century revival of tapestry as a medium for modern art. And in doing so, I hope to draw attention to both the complexities of producing tapestries, as well as the important labor performed by women in the art world more generally. Women revived tapestry by opening galleries and commissioning works, by corresponding with artists and weavers, by drawing diagrams and selecting colors, by organizing exhibitions and writing publications, authorizing reproductions and managing estates, and much more. And we tend to marginalize this kind of labor not just as craft or design, but as administration or commerce, and to see it merely as an adjunct to the real or creative work of making art. And yet, without all of these forms of labor, the modern tapestries that we see today simply wouldn't exist. So modern tapestry has interested me for a long time because it helps illuminate these other forms of labor that go into making art. But I think another fascinating aspect of tapestry is its very long history of prestige. And it can be hard for us as Americans to really wrap our minds around this because we're really just not familiar with the prestige of tapestry. I think we tend to assume that it's a marginalized art form, perhaps traditionally practiced by women, possibly as a hobby in the home. But that dramatically misunderstands the role of tapestry in Europe, and particularly in France, which has long prided itself on its tradition of excellence in the luxury crafts. And in fact, tapestry weaving was considered far too prestigious and too important to the French state to be made by mere women. It was a relatively elite, male-dominated profession, traditionally passed down from father to son for generations. And women participated in the production of textiles in other ways. They were an important source of inexpensive labor, for example, in the textile mills that powered the Industrial Revolution. And as a burgeoning middle class increased demand for pile rugs and carpets, some private workshops like Brunswick and Fies, which you see images of here on the right, began hiring women to hand weave rugs for this kind of growing middle class market. And you can see that on the far right image. But you will see in the images in the center, let's see, I have a pointer. Yes, in the center, that men are still being reserved for the more prestigious occupations of designing and weaving tapestries. And on the far left, I'm showing you kind of contemporaneous images. All of these images are from around 1910. The images on the left are from the Gobelin workshop in Paris, which is one of the state-run tapestry weaving workshops in France. And above, you can see that men are weaving. Women do not weave here at the Gobelin. And below, you can see that where the women are working is actually in what's called the conservation workshop, or the atelier de réparation, as it's termed in French. And so this is a workshop where women are repairing existing tapestries, and they're working largely by sewing rather than weaving. So the sewing was considered, something that the women could do, but they were not allowed to do the weaving. So we can see through these kinds of images that to the extent that women entered the labor force of these elite weaving workshops, it was really in these more marginal roles of repairing existing tapestries or perhaps making rugs designed for a more middle-class, sort of broader market. So it was really not until the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II that women in France began to weave tapestries side by side with men. As the market for modern tapestry expanded during the post-war period, many of the new recruits to weaving were women, but this shift really contested rather than reinforced traditional notions of women's art in France. In the past, French women who made tapestries at home were actually embroidering what the French call tapestry au point, needle points, rather than making these much larger woven tapestries that require enormous looms, as you can see. So the women who took up this more monumental task of tapestry weaving as a career in the 20th century were really breaking barriers by inserting themselves into this elite, restricted, male-dominated profession that had traditionally been controlled by large manufacturers and the state. But before we get to some of these independent women weavers, I want to turn our attention to the role played by the tapestry publisher, what the French call the éditeur, or if she's a woman, the éditrice. This figure put up the money to produce tapestries, commissioning artists for their designs, and commissioning weaving workshops to execute them, and then sold the final works at art galleries, hopefully for a profit. And one of the best known of these tapestry publishers is Marie Cottoli, a fashion designer and art dealer who was one of the earliest promoters of modern tapestry in the 20th century. In 1922, she opened a fashion boutique in Paris called Mirbeau, and soon began commissioning Parisian artists to design rugs that were woven by women in Algeria, which her husband represented as a French senator. So a photograph of the interior of the Mirbeau boutique on the right, taken around 1929, shows how Cottoli displayed fashion, textiles, and art together. Clothing hangs on dress models, rugs by Jean Lorsa and Fernand Léger are visible on the floor, and display cases along the wall hold North African sculptures and ceramics. Cottoli followed the precedent of Paul Poiret and other designers in creating an enterprise that was as much an interior design boutique as a fashion house. But Cottoli soon moved away from fashion to pursue a more sort of traditional career as an art dealer. She renamed Mirbeau the Galerie Vignon and focused on showing the works of emerging modernists. So for example, Alexander Calder had his first exhibition of mobiles there in 1932. At the same time, Cottoli shifted her attention from rugs and embroideries made in Algeria to tapestries that could be woven at the more prestigious workshops in Aubusson and Felletin in central France. By 1939, she had commissioned tapestries by Georges Braque, Le Corbusier, Raoul Dufy, Fernand Léger, Man Ray, Henri Matisse, Juan Miró, and Pablo Picasso, among other modernists. And in the midst of her tapestry commissions, she joined forces with the more established art dealer, another woman named Jean Boucher, and together they opened the Galerie Jean Boucher Mirbeau in 1935. So here, Cottoli and Boucher often showed tapestries together with paintings and sculpture, as you can see in this somewhat blurry 1935 advertisement for the gallery, which lists up top paintings, sculptures, and tapestries. And the single image, in fact, is a tapestry by Georges Rouault. And this suggests to me that Boucher and Cottoli were really kind of banking on the rarity of modern tapestry at this early date to set their gallery apart. And so I've argued that ads like this show how Cottoli turned to tapestries, not despite her wish to focus on high art, but because of it. So her shift from rugs to tapestries reinforced her transition from a boutique to an art gallery, and her transformation from a fashion designer or interior decorator into an art dealer. Now, when Cottoli invited a modern artist to design a tapestry, she would ask them for a maquette or model, which could be a photograph, a drawing, a painting, or really any work that provided an image for the weavers to translate into its final form. And many of Cottoli's artists took advantage of her tapestry commissions to work on a larger scale, creating models that were much bigger than their typical work and that, precisely for that reason, have often been celebrated for their rarity after the fact. So, for example, when the Museum of Modern Art made Miraut's painting, Hirondelle Amour, a feature of its major 2019 exhibition, Juan Miró, Birth of the World, which some of you may have seen, it really celebrated this work as a rare example of the artist painting on a large scale, but never mentioned that the reason Miró made the painting so large was because it was a model for a Cottoli tapestry. And you can see an example of one of those Cottoli tapestries on the right. And you'll note that Cottoli's tapestry mirrors or flips the orientation of Miraut's painting, and that's not an error. That's just a reflection of the fact that weavers work from the back of the tapestry. And one of the great things about this exhibition is that you get to see a back of one of the tapestries. So you really get a sense of how the weavers, work from the back, and they tie off all their bobbins of thread on the back of the tapestry, et cetera. So traditionally, because they work from the back, the final tapestry tends to reverse or mirror the image provided by the artist's model. Now, MoMA's failure to mention the tapestry origins of this unusually large painting of Miraut's was particularly interesting to me because I knew through my research that the museum was well aware of this context and even took advantage of it to make sure that the painting wound up in MoMA's collection. So it was another woman, the celebrated curator Dorothy Miller, who helped broker the creation of the Miraut tapestry that's included here at the Clark. The painting was in the collection of Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a modern art collector and patron of MoMA, and he had bought the painting on Alfred Barr's recommendation in 1952. And he had included it on a list of promised gifts to MoMA. But then Rockefeller removed the painting from his revised list of promised gifts in 1969, and this caused a great deal of consternation at MoMA, as you can imagine. So Dorothy Miller suggested that Rockefeller's reason for wanting to keep the painting might be to preserve the arrangement of artworks at his country house, Kaikouet, which she knew he was considering donating to the state of New York. And indeed, Hirondelle Amour occupies a particularly prominent place in the music room at Kaikouet, which you can see on the left. But Dorothy Miller suggested that since Rockefeller already had a collection of modern tapestries, which is something I'll talk about in a bit, that he might be willing to have a tapestry made for the house and let the painting come to the museum as originally planned. So Miller knew that Miraut had painted Hirondelle Amour as a design for a Marie Cottoli tapestry, but she wasn't sure if the work had ever been woven. And in fact, we know at least one Hirondelle Amour tapestry was woven in the 1930s, not just because we saw a photo of it in Marie Cottoli's apartment, but also because it was actually shown in New York at the Sidney Janis Gallery in 1958 when it was acquired for the Seagram building. And so you can see, again, the same kind of flipped version of the tapestry on display in a fairly prominent New York building at the time that all of this kind of intrigue at MoMA is going on. So Rockefeller agreed to accept a tapestry version of Hirondelle Amour in place of the painting, and MoMA paid for an addition of 3 tapestries to be woven by the Manufacture de Gobelin, apparently at Miraut's insistence that it had, quote, the very best tapestry makers in the world. And you will note that these later tapestries do not flip or mirror the painted model, as Cottoli's early tapestries did, but rather they copy its orientation exactly. And that is precisely because these later tapestries are designed to reproduce or substitute for the painting in a way that the earlier tapestries were not. But despite that, Rockefeller was not satisfied with this tapestry copy, and he did not consider it a suitable alternative for the painting. William Rubin, another curator at MoMA, tried to convince Rockefeller of the tapestry's value by emphasizing that Miro had been enthusiastic about the project, that he had visited the Gobelins several times to supervise the selection of colors and the cartoon and the weaving. Rubin even claimed that he had had to travel to Paris to get the tapestry out of the country because, quote, the French customs had not wanted to part with it as a French national treasure. But Rockefeller would not accept the tapestry, and the museum ultimately convinced Miro to authorize a painted copy of Hirondelle Amour to replace the one at Kaikouet. Rockefeller was satisfied with that, and today this painted copy continues to hang in the music room at Kaikouet. And I'll just note that Kaikouet is now open to the public as a National Trust for Historic Preservation property. It's in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and if you haven't been, I highly recommend going. You can see more modern tapestries in the basement if you go. So Cottoli launched the careers of several artists, or the tapestry careers, I should say, of several artists, including most notably Jean Lorsa, who you learn about in the exhibition. In 1939, after Lorsa had been designing rugs and tapestries for Cottoli for several years, the French government commissioned him and fellow artists Marcel Gromer and Pierre Dubreuil to create modern tapestry designs for the flagging workshops in Aubusson. And Aubusson was a very important historic center of French tapestry production that had fallen on hard times during the Depression. So Lorsa designed about 20 tapestries during the war, and he emerged afterward as the undisputed leader of the modern French tapestry revival. In 1947, he worked with his dealer, Denis Majorel, whom you can see on the left, to found an organization called the Association des Peintres Cartonniers de Tapestry, or the APCT, to promote the work of himself and other so-called painter cartoonists, or artists who created their own tapestry cartoons. The cartoon is a large working drawing or diagram that weavers use to translate an artist's model or maquette into the finished tapestry. So it's a kind of intermediary step between the work of the artist that's shown by their models and the work of the weavers shown in the final product. So cartoons are generally the same size as the finished tapestry. They are often black and white line drawings that indicate colors schematically through washes or numbered codes, and they can really be understood as blueprints for the final work. They're really working drawings. And the creation of cartoons had historically been left to weavers or to specialized cartoonists employed by the weaving workshops. So Lorsa and Majorel argued that by drawing their own cartoons, these artists in the APCT were designing specifically for tapestry, and therefore restoring the medium to a greatness that it had not enjoyed since the Middle Ages. So in publications such as Moraille et Laine, which you see a page of in the middle, Majorel explicitly compared modern works like Marcel Gromer's woodcolors of Mormal, which is a highlight of the exhibition, to medieval tapestries. And the Clark's current exhibition includes many of these APCT artists, including Lorsa and Gromer, but also Jean Bicard Ledoux, Marc Saint-Saëns, and Dom Robert. And as part of their modernist revival of medieval tapestry, these painter-cartoonist artists designed tapestries with fewer colors, simplified and abstracted forms, and the symbolism of animals and other natural elements. But even more fundamentally, they argued that they were making tapestry more medium-specific because weavers no longer had to imitate an artist's painted model, but could work directly from an artist's kind of autograph cartoon. And yet all of their innovations in the design and production of tapestries would have received much less attention without the tireless efforts of their dealer, Majorel, who devoted her Paris gallery, La Demeure, to modern tapestry. Majorel served as the secretary of the APCT, which I'm sure we all understand is a thankless job. She organized hundreds of tapestry exhibitions, she published numerous books on tapestry, and as part of her APCT work, she organized artists and weaving workshops to limit tapestry editions to 6 copies. She created tapestry labels that artists could sign by hand to authenticate their work, and she even successfully lobbied the US government to recategorize hand-woven tapestries as works of art to avoid import tariffs. So in many practical ways, large and small, it was really her labor that enabled the visibility of modern tapestries as works of art. And yet, she's really surprisingly understudied today. Another dealer who has enjoyed greater recognition for her tapestry work is Denise René. She's best known for promoting geometric abstractionists and op artists, such as Victor Vasarely, whose work you see here. And René began collaborating with the Atelier Tabard, a long-established private workshop in Aubusson, to create tapestries by abstract artists in the early 1950s. In 1966, she began selling these works at her left bank gallery, the Galerie Denise René Rive Gauche, which, as she explained to one of her artists, Joseph Albers, was, quote, dedicated to editions only and tapestries, multiples. So by establishing this gallery devoted to the twin multiples of tapestries and limited edition art prints in the somewhat bohemian area of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, René was clearly appealing to a younger and less affluent audience for abstract art. And it's important to keep this multiple nature of tapestry production in mind, that they were traditionally produced as limited editions with multiple copies of the same tapestry. And that's really because the labor of creating the tapestry is so much in the preparatory work of creating the cartoon, selecting colors, weaving samples, and securing the artist's approval, that by the time you've done all that, it's actually more economical to weave multiple copies of the same work, even though the weaving itself is so time-consuming. And there are maybe some exceptions to that. Kathy was telling me about some instances where the Mobilier National is like, no, we're not going to weave another one of those. It takes too long. So, but traditionally, you would weave a limited edition of multiple copies of the same work. So dealers like René encouraged both their collectors and artists like Albers, who had not previously designed tapestries, to consider the medium by comparing it to art prints. René had been publishing albums of prints by Albers since the early 1960s, and she explained to the artist that for him, the processes for producing his tapestries and art prints would be quite similar. Albers would send a model for a print or a tapestry to René, and he would receive a proof or a weaving sample in return, and on that proof or weaving sample, he could make his corrections. René even suggested that Albers could use one or more of his already extant prints as tapestry models, although she encouraged him to provide original tapestry designs. And indeed, when artists like Vasarely created original designs, which Vasarely did exclusively, René capitalized on them by publishing them in the catalogs of her tapestry exhibitions. And this gave potential collectors insight into the working process and really highlighted the innovation of the artist's design. So here, for example, we can see on the left is Vasarely's cartoon for a tapestry called Vega, which is similar in design to Dame A, which is in the Clark's exhibition. You can see how a grid of squares seems to stretch over a sphere in the center of the tapestry, and this apparent bulge is created through the manipulation of light and shade, as well as the perspectival warping of the grid. In this next example, we can see how a simpler design creates an optical illusion of depth through color alone. A grid of circles moves from light to dark as it moves outward from the center, creating the effect of light hitting the center of a work that seems to kind of descend down and out, or alternatively of an object that seems to glow from within. And Vasarely's cartoon for this effect is surprisingly simple. A gradation of tones is numbered 1 through 10, so that the numbers begin in the center with 1 and radiate out 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., until we get to 10 all along the outer edge. So again, a kind of, the seeing the cartoon really kind of shows you as the potential collector the kind of innovation of the design. Now, unlike tapestry publishers who ran their own galleries, Gloria Ross was not a dealer in this traditional sense like René or Cottoli, but she was one of the most prolific publishers of modern tapestries in the United States. She produced nearly 100 designs by 28 artists, including Robert Motherwell and Kenneth Nolan, whose work you can see in the photograph of Ross on the left. and other members of the late modernist canon. And Ross met many of these artists through her sister, Helen Frankenthaler, who also designed tapestries for Ross. Frankenthaler's large-scale tapestry commission for a bank in Wichita, Kansas, which is known as the Wichita Tapestry, is particularly well documented. Frankenthaler designed the tapestry by painting a maquette, or a small color model of the work, and Ross sent the maquette to the Atelier Pinton in Felletin, France, which she engaged to weave the work, along with her own hand-drawn diagram, which you can see below here, that included detailed instructions on how to follow or depart from the painted model. So, for example, the left-hand section of her diagram instructs weavers, quote, all edges should be copied as exactly as possible. For example, note change from rough edge to smooth edge. But it also warns, do not include small dark dots which seem to be in the canvas. So there's these kind of notes about what to ignore and what to pay attention to. Atelier Pinton then sent back small weaving samples showing possible colors and weaving techniques for the final work. And Ross provided her feedback on these in a series of annotated diagrams. So this first diagram notes, all edges of green should be somewhat fuzzy and piqué. These edges, pointing over here to the left, are too hard and should be more like this, pointing over here. Please note that edges almost throughout tapestries should be soft. It is an important characteristic of Frankenthaler's work. Look carefully at maquette. Her colors flow easily. So in these and other instructions, Ross directed the French weavers to capture the painterly quality of Frankenthaler's work, in which broad swaths of thinned paint seep into one another and the canvas. Ross's mix of censure and praise, her notes are also full of positive comments, such as good color and good edge, really helped translate Frankenthaler's quite small maquette into a monumental finished work, a tapestry 9.5 feet tall and 42.5 feet long. And the monumentality of this final tapestry really underscores the collaborative nature of making it, as Ross labored to accurately and sensitively interpret her sister's painting for the weavers who would execute it in the new medium. Now, to understand how weavers responded to these kinds of instructions from tapestry publishers, it is instructive to look at the example of Jacqueline de la Baume d'Urbach, an independent weaver with a mouthful of a name in Cavalier, France, in the south of France. And she executed tapestries primarily by her friend and neighbor, Pablo Picasso. Rather than creating new maquettes to serve as original tapestry designs, as Frankenthaler did with the Wichita Tapestry, Picasso most often authorized de la Baume d'Urbach to use one of his existing paintings as a model. And the primary patron of these Picasso tapestries was Nelson Rockefeller, whom, as I mentioned earlier, had an extensive collection of modern tapestry, largely of these Picasso tapestries. He had 18 of these in total. And Rockefeller also had a private collector, Carol Oud, who devoted considerable effort to improving the fidelity of these works, which she really considered reproductions of the original Picasso paintings. And she tried to enforce quality control, let's say, over their production. But her correspondence with the weaver, as well as the finished tapestries themselves, really show that de la Baume d'Urbach insisted on her role as a co-creator with Picasso. And the production of this work, the Night Fishing at Antibes tapestry, was particularly fraught. Oud spent many hours trying to direct de la Baume d'Urbach's weaving by creating highly detailed diagrams of the work, going well beyond even Ross's level of instruction to map every inch of the composition with clear directions. This diagram that I'm showing you on the upper left details the heart shape that forms the torso of the work's far right figure. So this one shape gets an entire diagram. You can see that the heart shape is embellished with kind of stars and crosses in the painting. Oud enlarged these symbols to show every single brushstroke and labeled each with an alphanumeric code that corresponded to the colors of yarn that de la Baume d'Urbach was supposed to use. But the weaver actively resisted this minute level of control when Oud wrote, quote, "The richness of the brushwork must be stimulated or the tapestry will be only a ghost of the original conception." De la Baume d'Urbach responded that in order to respectfully translate the painting into a tapestry, she could not copy the brushwork at all. This error, she wrote, has been banished since the renovation of French tapestry, and this is Picasso's firm will. So here the weaver relied in part on the authority of Picasso to imply that she only worked under the direction of this great artist, but she also insisted on her own authority as one of those renovating or reviving French tapestry to no longer merely copy painters' models, but to translate them in ways that respected the specificity of the tapestry medium. Her translation of this heart shape, for example, reduced Picasso's stars to simple graphic marks that stand out in starker contrast with the surrounding ground than they do in the more softly modulated brushwork of Picasso's painting. The cumulative effect of such changes was to render the tapestry versions of this and other of Picasso's compositions flatter and more graphic in the tapestry version than in their painted model. Colors are often brighter and higher contrast in the tapestries. Curves turn into zigzags, overlapping planes fit against one another in a single layer. Now, it's open to debate whether these changes diminish Picasso's work or, as I've argued elsewhere, actually enhance the cubic fracturing of space and conventionalization of pictorial signs that Picasso is so celebrated for. But whether one views the tapestries in positive or negative terms, I think we can't deny that de la Baume de Box had a significant role in shaping their final appearance. But it's important to recognize how she willingly shared this authorial role with Picasso. She had the artist approve each finished tapestry before she sold it. And on the left, I'm showing you one of these kind of occasions when she would present the finished tapestry to Picasso for his approval. And after Picasso's death in 1973, she continued to make tapestry versions of his work that were approved by the artist's widow, Jacqueline Roque. And tapestry publishers quite frequently called upon artist widows and heirs to authorize reproductions of extant works, or sometimes to complete editions that had already been started. And in this way, modern tapestry illuminates the active role that artist widows played in shaping the reception of their husband's creative output. But widows held many different positions within this dynamic. Some, for example, Fernand Léger's widow Nadia Léger financed the production of tapestries and liaised with weaving workshops to control their appearance, really operating kind of as their own tapestry publisher. For Rockefeller, these tapestries could differ from the paintings on which they were based, as long as he could attribute those differences to the intervention or the authorship of Picasso. Rockefeller even asked de la Baume de Box to have Picasso sign authenticating photographs of each tapestry, in essence asking the weaver to position a different artist as their primary author. And the weaver succeeded in getting Picasso to sign these authenticating photographs, but when she sent them back to Rockefeller, she reminded her patron that Picasso had already signed the tapestries by having his signature woven into each one, together with a monogram for the Atelier Cavalier, which was the name of Jacqueline de la Baume de Box's workshop. And this dual signature was a long-standing tapestry convention and really reinforced a sense of shared authorship. You can see an example of it here, along with a label from the back of one of her tapestries, in which you can see that de Box's name and the monogram for the Atelier Cavalier really overshadow the name of the artist, in this case, Fernand Léger. And you can also see the title of the work, L'Homme à la Pastèque, the dimensions, and then also the edition number. So in this case, this is example, or copy number 2. Now, tapestry weavers justified the presence of two authors by drawing on the model of translation. According to this model, the tapestry translates the painting into a new formal language or medium. The translation corresponds to the author's original writing, but is also the product of a new writer's expertise, namely familiarity with a second language and the skill of translation itself. De la Baume de Box's position as an artistic translator was well established in the French sphere of tapestry production. She was somewhat unusual in having such a small workshop in which she executed nearly all the work herself, and for being located away from the traditional centers of tapestry production. She and her husband, who was also an artist, moved to the south of France when they married in 1949, and at that time, de la Baume de Box had just completed a tapestry weaving apprenticeship in Paris after studying sculpture for 3 years at the Académie Julian. Her ability to retrain in tapestry weaving and establish a successful weaving enterprise in Cavalier speaks to how the post-war revival of French tapestry really expanded the industry by bringing new weavers, artists, and dealers into the trade and extending production beyond the confines of Paris and Aubusson. Although de la Bonderbach did weave works of her own design, usually with wool left over from other commissions, she was really best known for weaving tapestries after the work of Cubist artists such as Picasso. And she participated in many group exhibitions. She had numerous one-person shows of her tapestry translations. But these exhibitions really celebrated her work as a translator or interpreter of great modernists, focusing on both her skill of execution and her sensitivity to the original model. So they presented de la Bonderbach as a named artist with unique talents, but only exhibited the work she made after or in imitation of that of other artists. So in this sense, de la Bonderbach was comparable to other tapestry translators. I think Pierre Baudouin, the cartoonist who translated works by Le Corbusier, is mentioned in the exhibition. Another contemporary is Yvette Coquille-Prince, who is known for her collaborations with Marc Chagall. So these figures were recognized in France for their artistry, but for the art of translating the works of greater geniuses into new forms. Now, as I mentioned, Coquille-Prince was a near contemporary of de la Bonderbach's, about a decade younger, and she had similar success as an independent weaver collaborating with famous modern artists. She had trained as a painter in her native Belgium and in Paris, but was largely self-taught as a weaver. And she's best known for her execution of over 40 tapestries by Marc Chagall, but she also of the work of other highly expressionist artists such as Max Ernst. So unlike the Cubist, more geometrically abstract work of de la Bonderbach, Coquille-Prince is known for her painterly style, for being able to capture the variety and apparent spontaneity of an artist's brushwork, which is incredibly difficult in the far from spontaneous medium of tapestry. So she created guide marks on her full-scale cartoons to indicate variations for the type of woven stitch, whether they should be tighter or looser, larger or smaller, shaded or blended with the neighboring color, staggered to suggest curvature, etc. And you can see that the caption for this photo is indicating YCP writing her code on this cartoon for the Eye of Silence. And then the actual weaving was done by a team of craftspeople, men and women together at her workshop in Saint-Florent in Corsica. And this production model of having a larger workshop to execute her work really enabled her to create truly monumental tapestries, such as the gigantic Totem and Taboo, which you see here, measures 4 by 5 meters. And these are just sort of installation photos I'm showing you of that same Eye of Silence tapestry that whose cartoon she was working on in the previous photo. When François Maté, the curator of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, described Coquille-Prince's work, he wrote, "The artist is moved to tears when he discovers that the small watercolor he painted earlier has been transformed without having lost its character." And he described Coquille-Prince as the good fairy and craftsman who, quote, who has transported it into a magnificent and sensual world previously unknown to the artist. So, slightly smaller in scale is, at 9 by 14 feet, is the Chagall tapestry that she executed for the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee, which is where I live. Commissioned by the museum in 1972, this was the first Chagall tapestry in the United States. And it was designed to honor Golda Meir, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, and who had spent most of her childhood and young adulthood in Milwaukee. So one of the women in the tapestry represents Meir, and the other represents women of the Bible, the two together symbolizing women of valor. The main figure, a prophet, tells the history of the Jewish people, and his book contains prophecies of peace, wisdom, and mutual understanding. The red bird symbolizes the joy and hope, but also the suffering of the Jewish people, and the blue bird symbolizes the hope and good fortune of the young country of Israel. The crescent moon glowing between the two birds suggests dreams for a better future. Hanging prominently in the atrium that serves as the entrance hall to the museum, this tapestry is the first stop on public tours and serves as an introduction to the complicated history of Jewish Milwaukee that the museum explores. And as such, I think it's an interesting example of modern tapestry that still plays an important public function today, just as it did when it was first commissioned 50 years ago. But as we've seen so far, most of the artists who were commissioned to design such prominent, monumental tapestries were men. Because tapestry weaving is such a labor-intensive and expensive undertaking, most producers focused on soliciting designs by well-known artists. And so for all artists, being asked to design a tapestry was evidence of either a ready market for their work or a sign that they had reached a certain level of prestige in their career. As the architect and painter Le Corbusier, whose work is in the exhibition, wrote to his mother when Marie Cottoli first invited him to design a tapestry, quote, "I'm entering the company of Picasso, Leger, Matisse, Rouault. I am delighted." When Marie Helena Vieira da Silva, she's known primarily as a post-war abstract painter, but she was one of the few French women artists who seems to have designed tapestries really throughout her career. Her early dealer was Jean Boucher, the business partner of Marie Cottoli. So she likely was introduced as early as the 1930s to Cottoli's tapestries, and she designed at least one rug for Cottoli, possibly as early as the 1930s. In 1953, she won a contest to design tapestries for the University of Basel. And she worked with fine art students at the school to create 2 full-scale cartoons in tempera on craft paper, which I'm showing you on the right. On the left is her kind of initial design that she submitted to the contest. After these full-scale cartoons were completed, 78 women who were wives of the university's professors spent 5.5 years, around 6,300 hours in total, executing these works as tapestries au point, or needle points, or embroideries. And they were finally displayed to the public in 1960. Another of Vieira da Silva's initial submissions to this contest is on the left, is among the artist's work that have been woven by the Manufactura Tapecerias de Portalegre in the artist's native Portugal. And this was an atelier established just after World War II that competed with French workshops in the modern tapestry revival. But as we know from the exhibition, by the 1960s, Vieira da Silva was also designing tapestries for France's state-owned workshops, the Gobelins, including the one in the exhibition. And like other painters in this post-war school of Paris, Vieira da Silva's work was viewed both positively and negatively as inherently decorative, as a type of abstraction well-suited to the decorating schemes of modern interiors. And I've argued elsewhere that in this post-war period, abstract art and tapestries in particular were often intended to humanize or warm up the potentially cold, unappealing environments of modern spaces, whether those were corporate headquarters or, as we can see here, airplanes. So when Air France introduced the Boeing 747 to its fleet in 1970, the company commissioned fiber artist Sheila Hicks to create mural-like tapestries that covered the entire back wall of the bar area. She designed 18 in all, and they were also completed in the needlepoint technique, tapestries au point, in which thread is woven through a canvas backing, and also created with the assistance of another group of anonymous women, this time Parisian nuns. So departing from the more colorful compositions of her tapestry artist contemporaries, Hicks created an entirely monochromatic work whose visual interest derives from its irregular grid of highly textured squares. Images of Hicks embroidering the work show the tapestry emerging as a kind of collage of smaller and larger squares against the canvas backing. And we can just make out the faint sort of semicircular outline at the top of her loom, which shows the kind of dimensions of the space in the Boeing 747 that she is designing for. Another photograph of Hicks in front of the loom shows a photo of the Boeing 747 in the background, kind of reinforcing the site specificity of this commission. This monochromatic, all-over patterning of the work reinforces its role as a decorative background, a tapestry fully integrated with its architectural setting. And this is certainly how Hicks's tapestry functions in the publicity image we can see on the right, where smiling, well-dressed passengers enjoy each other's conversation and the services of the bartender and flight attendant, but they're paying about as much attention to the carpeted wall behind them as they are to the carpeted wall, or the carpeted floor, I should say, underneath their feet. So the fact that Hicks created tapestries like this to be so integrated with an architectural surround and a decorative scheme is interesting because what she's really best known for today are her three-dimensional fiber sculptures, like the one you see on the left, in which yarn is often spooled into balls or skeins that pile on the floor or hang from the ceiling. So another woman artist whose textile work really skirts this conventional division between fine art and design is Sonia Delaunay. Delaunay did a wide range of work in textile design, fashion, and interior decor, including a series of tapestries in the post-war period that really helped mark her arrival as a recognized artist. She first worked with the dealer Denise René to make tapestries with the Atelier Tabard in the 1950s, and then designed works for the French state that were woven at the Manufacture des Gobelins, such as this one in the exhibition. And she also designed works for other private workshops in Felletin and also for Jacqueline de la Baume de Bach. Some of these tapestries were exhibited at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris in 1972, when they were presented really as the triumphant conclusion to her career. Jacques Lassagne, the museum's chief curator, described the artist's move to tapestry as both inevitable and a mark of the stature that Delaunay had achieved. It was not only the logical outcome, but also the, quote, completion of her entire creative process. So according to Lassagne, tapestry offered her the opportunity to pursue more complex compositions and to, quote, project her thoughts on the wall in a language that was suppler and warmer than that of painting, yet had what he called an equal force and richness. So tapestry really provided visibility, monumentality, and prestige to the abstract forms and dynamic contrasts of color that Delaunay had been exploring throughout her entire body of work. But her earlier textile projects anticipate these later tapestries, not just in their form or their medium, but also in their labor of production. Because Delaunay's earlier work was not just that of a creative artist, but also quite often that of an éditrice or publisher who corresponded with textile manufacturers and revised samples in order to, in addition, I should say, to creating prototypes and hand-making finished works like the one you see on the left. And really, it's only quite recently that we have begun to recognize all of these forms of labor as part of Delaunay's creative output in exhibitions such as this one at the Bard Graduate Center, which you can see installation images of here. This exhibition showed the same Delaunay tapestry as the one at the Clark, but contextualized it with the artist's earlier work in painting, mosaic, and other media, as you can see here. So I think it's important to recognize that tapestry is just one of many media that modernists worked in to broaden their market for their work. Just as Delaunay designed clothing and textiles, Vieira da Silva created prints to illustrate books and stained glass windows, Helen Frankenthaler designed ceramic tiles, etc. But tapestry really differed from these other media in two important ways. First, because of its long history of prestige as a monumental state-sponsored art, and second, because it outsources so much of its production to others, to workers who are often demeaned as good fairies, but who are really seasoned experts whose incredible skill in executing monumental, complex designs can make the finished tapestries appear to be magical creations. Tapestry helps us see this collaborative artistic labor more clearly, and thus calls attention to the often overlooked roles played by fabricators, dealers, curators, or artist widows in actually producing the works of art that we credit to individual authors. Many of these roles have historically been played by women, whose unpaid or underpaid labor continues to support today's art world, an art world that in many ways relies on the underpaid labor of women to continue its existence. So when we see a tapestry exhibition, I think we naturally ask ourselves, like, wow, how did they make this? But that's something we can ask and really should ask of all the art that we see. Not just how it was made, but by whom, so that we can recognize all of the forms of labor, whether commercial, administrative, manual, or creative, that form the work in the work of art. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions, if there are any questions.
Just a lovely comment. The Buddhists have a grace at meal that begins 72 labors brought us this food. So thank you so much for saying that about art.
Yes, I've talked to weavers who are like, it's tedious, but that's sort of part of the, the process. It's, not every aspect of making art is necessarily like a spontaneous, creative, exciting moment, but it's still, important labor that goes into it. Yeah. Other questions?
Thank you for your talk. I think about tapestries from the Renaissance period, covering large spaces, huge, castles or whatever. And I think about these and the spaces that could accommodate them. And is there, was there a thought about public spaces versus private spaces? I mean, how many people could fit these in their homes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would say the market varied. So there, certainly a lot of the works in this exhibition are made by the French state workshops or collected by them. So they are intended for larger public spaces, embassies. They're often given as gifts, diplomatic gifts. There are these kinds of modern tapestries like at the Kennedy Center and, other kinds of, public kind of cultural buildings. In the post-war period, they also became popular for corporate art collections in lobbies and sometimes offices, in houses of worship, which were, experiencing a building boom. So many different types of spaces, but yes, primarily perhaps larger public spaces. But they were also used by people in their homes. Architects like to collect them and have them in their living rooms. I actually still see them today in shelter magazines. So there is, they are inconvenient in some ways because they are so large. But they are convenient in others because they roll up easily. They, I think because they are kind of inherently, not inherently, but because they're so traditionally decorative, people don't feel bad like putting them behind a sofa or, kind of obscuring them slightly. And that is, just part of their history of how they were used and displayed. So yeah, I think they, it is interesting when you have a rare opportunity to see them in a domestic setting because I think they really kind of come alive in a way. Like you can really kind of understand how they fit together with the architecture, how they kind of, make it more colorful and sort of bring out the kind of handcraftedness of sort of all the things, in the space. They have a sort of warmth and humanness to them that is very appealing. And so, yeah, it's unusual, but it is very nice to see them in private spaces.
I'm interested in the transition between the generations of male weavers to now predominantly women. They were trained at Aubusson, and were they considered artisans? Were they considered skilled laborers? Were women not allowed to go to Aubusson, just as they couldn't go to the Academy of Fine Arts? How does that transition? And were women considered skilled artisans as well when they became the weavers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the sort of groundwork for the post-war tapestry revival is trying to reform how weavers are trained and trying to give them more artistic education. And part of that is kind of letting women into the training process. So there is a kind of, it's called the École Nationale Aubusson, something, I think, anyway, I'm not sure I can't remember now off the top of my head what the abbreviation stands for, but it's like an École des Beaux-Arts. It was run by the state, it was in Aubusson, and it was training weavers, but it was trying to integrate weaving with designing cartoons, selecting colors, and more of that kind of artistic work. So that is how women sort of first start to kind of enter the sort of formal training process. As it is reformed, it's kind of opened out, to people who just want to apply to join or to get the training, rather than it being a kind of like, oh, well, here's my son. He has learned from me. He will just take over. So that's an important part of kind of how women are able to enter the field. Nowadays, I wouldn't necessarily say that in the French State workshops it's predominantly women. I think it's, I don't know, I have no idea, but maybe 50-50, maybe mostly women. But the main criteria to be selected for to be a weaver of the French State is your ability to discern color and differences in color. So there is a test. It's basically a civil service job, and you have to kind of pass the test to get in, to do the training, to make it your lifetime career, because once you've trained in it, you're probably not going to leave. It's a cushy job. Well, I don't know, cushy is maybe not the right word, but it's a desirable job. So yeah, that's the main kind of thing that they feel they can't really train you in, which is how well can you discern these minute differences between colors. One of the last tapestries in the exhibition is a kind of photorealist tapestry of a woman with her arm out and a car in the background. And Kathy, you told me there were something like 9,000, sorry, how many? 140 colors in that tapestry. And someone is picking those 140 colors, right, and figuring out how to manipulate them to create that final effect. So yeah, that's not something that's easy to teach. But yeah, great question.
Hi, two questions. One, in the case of Durbach, what was her relationship with the dyeing of the wool? Mm-hmm. And therefore any other weavers, but her particularly because you said she had a small studio in her home. And then secondly, is there a museum somewhere in the world that has a collection of tapestries that you find particularly impressive?
Yes, good question. So they're, I would say, mostly in France. I do if you want to see the Picasso tapestries in particular, I do recommend going to Kaikouet. And yeah, like the Musée Picasso in Antibes has some of these tapestries. The Leger Museum has some tapestries. L'Orsat has his own museum in Angers. The Gobelin has a museum. Beauvais has a museum. There's a museum in Aubusson. You can do a lovely road trip through France, trying to see all the tapestry museums. They tend to be in small, out-of-the-way places. But yeah, that's a great question about de la Baume d'Urbach's colors. I think she did have a separate dyer. In her correspondence, she talks about kind of working with a dyer, sending samples to and from, and having there's a lot of the correspondence is about like, why don't we have the tapestry yet? And why has there been a delay? And she sometimes explains that by saying like, oh well, I'm waiting for the yarns from the dyer. So yeah, I think that was outsourced. But that was a big part of the kind of development of the cartoon, and the plan was figuring out which colors to use. And she always kind of says that she gets Picasso to approve them, but I'm not sure she really did. I think that was just, her way of putting Rockefeller off. But yeah, so no, she's not doing her own dyeing. And that is not something I really get into in my book, but that is certainly another very interesting aspect of the history of tapestry in France. The sort of originator of many ideas about color theory is Chevreul, who worked at the Gobelin, who developed his theories to improve the ability of tapestry to kind of imitate painting, essentially, to have these kind of minute sort of differences in color. So that was very influential on Seurat and other painters who really kind of in some ways model their work on tapestry, on the way it kind of conveys color through this juxtaposition of, stitches or points, right, of pixels, instead of blending them together the way you would in a painting. So yeah, there's been other work on that, but that's a very interesting kind of another way in which tapestry and painting have really influenced one another.
I'm very sorry to say that this will be the last question.
So you've
mentioned tedium a number of times, and then you've gotten into the colors. Can you give us a little more perspective as to what is the tedium? How do they do what we're looking at? I can't imagine. I can hardly imagine somebody painting, but to use threads. Can you elaborate a bit?
Sure. So I will try to, yes, go back to this. So these are images of Jacqueline de la Bonderbach working on a low warp loom, which just means that it's a loom that is horizontal. The warp is the kind of stationary threads. So these threads that you see here, or here, when you string up the loom, right, you kind of, or you warp it, you stretch out the warp threads on the loom, hold them, taut. That's a very labor-intensive process right there. And then the weaver weaves in the weft, which is the threads that we see in the finished tapestry, the colored threads. So you can see here she's lifting up part of the warp to slide weft through. The weft is wound around these bobbins, and when she kind of weaves it through, I think that's what you can see here. So you can see here the weft is being kind of built up. Every time you weave one of the weft threads through, you have to push it down to create what's called a weft-faced tapestry. So tapestries are weft-faced, that's part of their definition, meaning you only see the weft. So the warp is completely covered by the weft. That is unlike many other forms of weaving, where both the warp and the weft together create the pattern. In tapestry, only the weft is really visible in the finished product. And because of that, so tapestry is weft-faced, as I just explained. It's also discontinuous, which means that the weft threads don't go all the way across the tapestry. You can tie in a little weft thread. It can be 1 inch long. It can be, many feet long. There's no restriction, right? And so that means that you can create a design of anything. It could be any image, right? Any picture. There's no kind of limitation. It doesn't have to be geometric. It doesn't have to, be a plaid, right? It can be anything. So that discontinuous weft face is really what sort of defines tapestry. All of this, every single thread is sort of, stitched through or woven through, pushed down, and then once you're done with that color, you tie that thread off and you start with the next one. It's very time-consuming, yeah. And also one of the crazy things about it is that, here she's sort of, I guess this is from the back, right? So the weavers work from the back of the tapestry, so they're working kind of in reverse in that sense. They also often work sideways, right? So when we see a really, any of these tapestries that are kind of more horizontal, wider than they are tall, the weaver doesn't weave from the long edge and go up or down. They weave from the side. They weave from the short edge and go across, right? So they're doing it backwards and sideways. I don't know how they do it. I've seen them do it, but I still don't understand it. So that's my best attempt to explain it. But it's magic, but also highly skilled and not to be marginalized. Yeah. Thank you.